Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cindy Edwards from PR Media Now. We are joined now by Christopher Moreau. He is the CEO of Algernon Pharmaceuticals. Good to see you again, Chris.
Hi, Cindy. Good to see you too. How are you?
Doing great, but we're not doing so great when it comes to COVID-19. Here in Canada, they're blaming Thanksgiving for a surge. It's happening across the country. We're seeing numbers going up in the United States and parts of Europe. So let's talk about your drug, ifenprodil. It is a repurposed drug that we're repurposing the drug that was created in the 90s for a circulatory issue, correct? And now you're testing it on COVID-19 patients to prevent lung damage. So tell us about phase 2 of this trial that is ongoing. Where is it happening right now, and how are we doing with the trial?
So, and just to correct you, but it was developed in the 1970s.
I'm so sorry about that.
No problem. So it's in fact, it's an older drug, and it was developed by Sanofi. It originally was developed for a circulatory disorder called intermittent claudication, which is a challenge of circulation in the lower legs. And it's an NMDA receptor antagonist for those chemists, biochemists in the audience, and but somehow because of its target and mechanism of action, it got approved for in South Korea and Japan for conditions that are neurological, including dizziness and vertigo. So we, as a company, Algernon Pharmaceuticals, is a drug development company. Our business model is repurposing drugs. We look for compounds that are off patent, but have had limited market exposure. So that means they haven't been approved in Canada or in Europe. And we investigate those drugs for new disease indications. And we have been advancing a drug called ifenprodil, which fits all of those categories. And it has had limited market exposure. We were investigating it for a serious disease of the lung called idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, and also for a condition called chronic cough. We are running a trial currently for that, those disease indications. And last March, we began a clinical program to investigate ifenprodil for COVID-19. So that's a bit of background. But to specifically answer your question, we are running a multinational trial for ifenprodil and COVID-19. It is being conducted in the US, in Australia, in the Philippines, and in Romania, in Bucharest. We announced a few weeks ago that we were at 75% enrollment. Our next announcement will be when we hit 100% enrollment. And I know folks are anxious to learn when that's going to happen. So not to be light about it, but we're somewhere between where we announced and 100%, and we're hoping to have that enrollment completed as soon as possible. It's one of the things we don't control, and that is the rate of enrollment. I know some have been sort of saying, well, we've enrolled so many per day historically, then making a projection, but there are a number of mitigating factors, and a few bits of information that I can share with everybody today, just to show you an example of how things change. In the US, at our 5 sites, we've screened 130 patients that did not qualify for our study, and simply because they were beyond just moderate disease. And so this is an example of how changes in the patient population can affect your study. For our study, you have to be hospitalized, you have to be confirmed COVID and on oxygen. If you're having to advance to mechanical ventilation, and that seems to be the case with our American patients that are being reviewed for our trial, they're presenting at the hospital at the ICU much sicker. Mm-hmm. And the speed of the disease is very, very quick. And so there's an example that changes to how patients are presenting, and that may be representative of different markets. But that's a long answer to your question as an opener, but that gives you a little bit of more background on what's going on. And I'm open to, of course, give you some more more details.
And we're welcoming questions from people who are watching as well. But in real layman's terms, what can COVID-19 do to the lungs that we are trying to prevent with ifenprotal?
Well, you always want to look at the data, although there are a number of news reports coming out, and they call them long haulers, people that survive a COVID infection. And when the pathogen hijacks the immune system, there's an over response in the lungs, there's an inflammatory response, and the immune system goes into overdrive and not only eliminates, in some people's cases, the disease, but also can end up damaging the lungs. And I haven't seen any data in terms of studies. I think everyone's really focused right now on trying to prevent or treat the disease. But probably there are studies that are starting now about what's happening to the patients who get out of the ICU and survive a COVID infection. I have read, excuse me, about almost an appearance of fibrosis. Pulmonary fibrosis is this scarring of the lung, which is a result of some sort of an infection or an insult. And that can be a very serious problem. And as some of our investors in the audience know, we were initially investigating ifenprotal to see if we could reduce fibrosis or scarring in the lung. And so that's what happens when patients, you're either going to get sick very quickly and you're not going to make it. You're not going to survive the disease, depending on certain conditions and factors. If you do survive, there are other problems that seem to be appearing in terms of lung function and so on.
Well, the last time we spoke, you said there could be 3 potential outcomes from this clinical trial. Number 1 is data shows it's not helping patients enough, so it goes away. Number 2, data is so compelling, it advances to phase 3. And number 3 is data proves it's working and Algernon is granted emergency use authorization. Patients start getting it immediately, but phase 3 trials would still be ongoing at the same time. So can you tell us how it's looking right now?
I really can't, because
Okay.
I don't know how it's looking, and really, again, you would be going on data.
Right.
And so the way that our trial was designed, the data is going to be, and data is entered as the trial carries on. So just to explain a bit of the mechanics, when people are entered into the trial, they're randomized. They are either going to be a group that they don't get ifenprotal, so they're in a no treatment arm. They just get standard of care, or they get a low dose of ifenprotal or a high dose of ifenprotal. Patients are treated, or they're entered into the trial immediately. That last patient, the 150th patient, once they're enrolled, it's 2 weeks of treatment and a 2-week follow-up. Then the trial closes. We get the data then is analyzed. There's an audit of the data that is conducted. I mean, this is it's a very serious process. This isn't the first clinical trial. All of these, it's under a quality system, and it's very highly regulated. So once the data is audited and they're satisfied that we can move on to the analysis, there are specialized algorithms that will look at all of the contributing factors, all of the conditions, what our endpoints are. We'll get the data at head office. We have a period of time that we'll have to review it, and then we can start to announce how the trial is going. So we've talked a bit about this before, and we get lots of requests, people wanting to know how the trial is going. But other than patients who may end up speaking about their experience, all of the physicians, the support team, they're all really trained through good practice to not be sharing information until all of the data is in. You don't want anecdotal data that somebody either did well or didn't do well
Right.
in the study, because it's not about that. It's what does the data say? Is it statistically significant? Is it repeatable and reproducible? And that's what we really want to find out. So we don't have any information yet. And so that's an answer to your question about how it's going. From the view of enrollment, we haven't made the announcement yet that we've enrolled 100%. We came out in our last news release and said we expect the trial to wrap up in November with data before the end of Q4. And if there's a change to that, then we'll come back to the market. So again, I know everyone's anxious. It's business as usual. We are enrolling patients and we're carrying on. Sometimes in a trial, you have fits and starts. So typically, and this is a bit more detail maybe than you expected, but you're in a normal trial. Let's say you're running a cancer trial at an institution. It's not a pandemic. You're investigating your drug. As you're enrolling patients, data is usually entered simultaneously. In a pandemic setting, ICU, hallway medicine, people are in trouble. They have limited staff. Sometimes you can have a delay between patient enrollment and the entering of a lot of data. And it's just not simple data entry. It's complex measurements. It requires specialized team to enter the data. There's no sense having 150 people enrolled, but now the data is lagging behind so far. You're still weeks or maybe even months away from analysis. So from time to time, you can have a slowdown period where you let the data catch up. Part of the data entry are physicians' notes and experience. They have to enter that into the process. These physicians are absolutely working 24-hour days. So it's a very complex, involved, and intense process. We are absolutely moving it forward as quickly as we can.
We've got a question from Amanda. I'm not sure if you can answer this one or not, but we'll throw it out there. The commerce of the world is US dollars. Given the fact that supply and demand will vary from country to country and regions within, can you give us a sense of the average cost of a treatment relative to the US $3,200 Gilead charges for remdesivir? What kind of profit margins do you forecast? Is it too early to say?
Yeah, it is too early to say. We haven't sort of engaged in the economics. We are, and we talked a bit about this in our last interview. We weren't planning to tackle a global pandemic. We were working on a serious disease of the lung and chronic cough. And part of our development plan was to be reformulating ifenprotal. And so part of the work we've been doing in the last few weeks, and we hope to have an update to the market on this, is to try to secure an immediate supply of ifenprotal in the event we do have positive phase 2b data and we receive emergency use approval from the US FDA. You're only going to get emergency use approval if you have product to sell. We're not ready, and we never said we would be ready, and we couldn't be ready to mass produce. And I threw out some numbers the last time I believe you and I spoke, Cindy, about what the potential monthly demand would be.
I recall between 30 and 40 million pills a month.
And that's, let me qualify that. That would be, of course, if we were the only game in town, there are other therapeutics, there was no vaccine. That would be sort of and that may happen, but it may take months to get there. So that would be sort of the maximum when I was trying to impart. And that's also at the maximum dose of ifenprotal. So if we find out in our data that our lower dose is as effective as our higher dose, then you would reduce that number. So that was to provide a quantum for people to sort of see how the big picture. We obviously have a concept of what our costs are, and certainly if we're gaining a supply of ifenprotal while we're working on the manufacturing and synthesis of it internally, and then working to scale it up. But we haven't, yes, I've looked at the cost of remdesivir and what's being charged. This would be a 2-week treatment, but we haven't made any decisions on pricing, and we don't have any information yet to disclose to the market.
Tom wants to know, is the end of Q4 the end of December 2020?
Yes, typically, and Tom's right, I should say calendar Q4 because companies have fiscal year ends, which could end at any month. So not fiscal Q4, but calendar Q4.
Last time we spoke, you mentioned trying to find a way to administer ifenprotal not only by pill, but through a needle. Is this
intravenous? Yes.
Intravenous, yes. Still happening?
Early work. Folks need to understand that when to change what is a drug that's orally consumed. So it's going into the body. It's been developed to get through the gut wall. Then it goes into the bloodstream. Most drugs are metabolized and they're almost eliminated in the liver. So chemists like Mark Williams, his job is to figure out how do I get this drug through the liver, or do we have to give enough of a dose that enough gets through that it can start to treat? When you're introducing an intravenous solution directly into the bloodstream, it bypasses the gut, where a lot of the destruction of the molecule happens. So you have a whole set of new toxicology work that needs to be done. This is obvious, is often multi-species, so multi-animal studies, takes time. We were, and we've started that process, but there's no way we would have that ready for January or the end of December. We just don't have the time. We did get feedback from the US FDA, and we did announce that they, in fact, suggested that we would only need one species for our toxicology. But there's an enormous amount of work between coming up with a new formulation, synthesizing a small amount of compound, stability testing on the active ingredient, then deciding to put it into a medium. Is it saline? There's a lot of technology that is available now to mix your compound with if you're giving it intravenously. There's lots of work. It would not be ready in the short time frame. We'd have to rely on the tablet form.
I have another question from Oliver. Has Health Canada acknowledged Algernon's ongoing efforts?
Well, they haven't reached out to us. I mean, we reached out to Health Canada when we requested approval for our multinational phase 2b3 data. We applied to Health Canada. We applied to the US FDA. We got Health Canada approval for the study initially, before we got the US FDA approval. So in that context, Health Canada knows about us. They have our protocol. We then reached out to a number of Canadian institutions. Folks have to keep in mind that even though you could read about 10,000 patients in a given country, you have to look at per province and then per city. How evenly distributed are the patients? It can cost $25,000 to $50,000 just to set up a clinical trial site. Costs can range from $25,000 to $50,000 per patient. So you might have an outbreak in Quebec, but it's over 50 different small towns. And so you've got a concentration of 5 or 6 at each center. So you typically want to go after larger centers. McGill University would be an example, McGill Hospital. And that would be where you would start and having that discussion. Then it becomes competitive. Now you've got a lot of companies, some of the big guns, who have relationships with these research centers, who are funding them annually. So their antibody treatment, their vaccine or therapeutics they're working on, they will get first blush or first look. So Health Canada knows about us. We were unable to secure any clinical trial sites in Canada for phase 2, for the phase 2 part. If the phase 2B trial is a success, the phase 3 will still need to be run, whether we get emergency use approval or not. We think a number of the larger institutions will then reach out to us and say, yes, now we want to be a part of this. The trial was successful. In the early days, we're looking for some friends and partners. Now they'll be reaching out to us. That's what typically happens in this sort of a setting.
No doubt. Okay, we're coming down to our last 10 minutes here. I've got a question from Adam. He says, given the known neuropsychiatric effects of COVID-19, the use of an NMDA modulator would seem complementary from this perspective in addition to its effects on the lungs. Will any endpoints be included to evaluate this aspect if it proceeds to a phase 3 trial?
It's a good question. It's more of a research question. Keep in mind that we're looking for, and we're lucky, we have a phase 2 trial. So we're looking for specific clinical results. What's their progression time from oxygen to mechanical ventilation, which would be like a CPAP, then on to mechanical intubation rather, where you're knocked out and the lung machine is breathing for you. How many days are you staying in the hospital? What's the severity of the infection? So we're looking for clinical results The question is very good. There is a neuronal application for the NMDA receptor. Those receptors are in the brain, and ifenprotal has a charge. I'm going to go into an area that Mark Williams is better to answer at, that helps it get past the blood-brain barrier. This is a barrier in the fabric of the arteries that run through the brain that keep a drug from getting into the brain. Ifenprotal does get into the brain, and it does work in the brain. But we believe anyway, with the effect that we saw in the animal studies, that we're looking at binding with the NMDA receptors on the neutrophil cells in the lung. And so we believe that even though it's neuronal, so there's a neurological effect, it's binding with the cells in the lung, it's interrupting the glutamate signaling, and that is reducing, we think, the inflammation and the inflammatory response, the cytokine storm, cytokines that are overexpressed in the lung when this infection happens. So that's a very good question, but this we believe is happening more at a local tissue application in the lung with ifenprotal.
Rhonda wants to know, can you tell us what number of enrollment we are at today?
I can't tell you if we decide to let everyone know, and we did announce, I think, 25%, 50, 75%. The next time most folks just want to know that we're at 100% instead of 89.3% or 92%. So I can't share that number today, but as soon as we hit 100%, we'll announce it. That's meaningful because then it's 30 days countdown, 2 weeks of treatment, 2-week follow-up. I've estimated about 30 days for data. Could happen earlier, and we'll be pushing for that. But so can't confirm the number today, but we will confirm 100 as soon as it happens.
Alex wants to know if there's any update on the Australia-New Zealand open label trial. Did you get that? Did you hear that, Chris?
The only update I can say is that I did hear it. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Maybe it's okay. An interesting update is that I'm not announcing any additional patients, but we have exclusion criteria, and you have inclusion criteria for every study. And one of our exclusion criteria was the age of the patient, and we had a number of patients, and there's a number of reasons for that. But we had a number of older patients who applied or we screened for the study. And we've sort of revisited, I think the number was 15 patients that had exceeded our maximum age for the study. We're consulting with our medical team to review that. We may change that inclusion criteria. And by revisiting these patients, we may have a very meaningful spike to our enrollment number. But that study is going along. Keep in mind, it's a 12-week treatment. For the chronic cough part of the study, when a patient enters the study, we take a baseline reading of their cough. Then we measure it 30 days later. And then at the end of the study, we do our third measurement. So that gives you some details on how that study is being run.
Okay, we're winding down here, but Sam asks, in the event it appears to be effective, would the emergency use approval be restricted to those on oxygen, or would the approval application include those not yet requiring oxygen and or those who have progressed to a ventilator?
Anything is possible, but typically the FDA would look at the current protocol we have, because that's what we know. Now, what's interesting a bit about ifenprotal, and I think folks can kick this around a bit, there are probably 200 to 300 drugs and therapies and treatments that are being explored right now. The benefit of a repurposed drug like ifenprotal is its 40-year known safety history, because you always have two elements in a study. You have the efficacy, how well the drug is working, but what is it doing? What are some of the adverse side effects? And you can imagine, take a cancer drug. There are some cancer drugs that you can only use for 2 or 3 weeks or 3 months because it's cardiotoxic. So you're balancing. In the case of ifenprotal, there are very few, if any, serious adverse effects. So the focus will be on the efficacy. It would be up to the approving regulator what they would allow, but minimally it would be what your study showed. And but in that case, because it's safe, they may come back and engage in a discussion to say either we want you to do another quick study, or we're confident enough in the safety element, do no harm. We have seen efficacy in this group. We may now want to expand the use, but minimally, it would be the data that you provide them based on what your exclusion and inclusion criteria are. What's your protocol and what are your endpoints?
Rhonda says, can you shed light on Dr. Sweem's appointment to Algernon?
I don't need to. I won't get specific about any of our team, just to say that when we bring on consultants or our advisory board, we are bringing that individual on because they have skill sets or they have a capacity to help advance the company and move it forward. I can say that so there's a vetting process that goes on for all of our consultants and advisory board members. All of our advisory team are bound by a confidentiality agreement, and whether it's board of directors, advisory board members, physicians, consultants, that confidential information disclosure agreement is very key, especially when you're a public company. No one can trade on or share confidential information or benefit from it. That's not okay, and something that is not okay and doesn't happen with Algernon.
We've got about 3 minutes left. And I just want to touch quickly on the fact that vaccines, they're being developed, but that doesn't mean therapeutics aren't going to be needed as well. Because just because you have a vaccine does not mean COVID-19 goes away. Can you just really quickly expand on that a little bit and how important it is to have these therapeutics in place?
Very important. In fact, there is a drug specialist out of the University of Maryland that was interviewed a few days ago who went on to say that the top vaccine trials being run today will not tell you if they reduce mortality or severe infection. So I'll explain what that means. So let's say that you have a vaccine that ends up with a 60% effectiveness. That means that 40% of the people that take the vaccine still get the infection. The current vaccine trials are only looking at, unless they make changes, the rate of infection. What I'm saying is that the vaccine may only stop people from getting COVID that would have ended up with a minimal reaction in any event. To find out, you also need to study, so it's longer term, people that are not protected by the vaccine. Are they the ones that are going on to hospitalization and possibly perishing from the disease? So the current studies, and it makes sense, you've got to start somewhere. There's enormous political pressure. There's enormous fear. The studies are being run properly, but more data is needed. And certainly this specialist from Maryland felt that the top vaccine developers should be looking at longer term data, not just infection rate, because if you're only saving people who would end up being asymptomatic or have a minimal response, then the value of the vaccine is diminished. So we want a vaccine. There will always be people that don't want to take the vaccine, and there will also be a maximum effectiveness. There is need and room for therapeutic drugs like ifenprotol and any other therapeutic that's being advanced. We need to invest, be thoughtful about that process as well, not just vaccines. It could take much longer, and it may not be the silver bullet that people are thinking about.
We've got less than 30 seconds left, so I'm going to leave it with you. Chris, any last words for us?
Just want to continue to thank all of our thousands of shareholders. We're working hard behind the scenes to get some answers on COVID-19 and also for IPF and chronic cough. And thanks again, and appreciate your support. And
for more information, go to algernonpharmaceuticals.com. Chris Moreau, always good to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Cindy. Nice speaking with you.
Nice speaking with you. And thanks to everybody who participated today as well. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.